in a quiet corner of a forgotten American town, where the paint peeled off the fences and hope felt like a myth, a 10-year-old boy named Zion walked barefoot through the frostbitten morning streets. His thin jacket did little to protect him from the bitter cold, and his empty stomach groaned louder with every step. Yet still, he walked toward a school he barely listened in, toward a future he barely believed in. Zion had nothing but a worn-out backpack and a heart filled with quiet resilience. He had no parents. They had vanished from his life in a brutal car crash when he was just 5. The orphanage he lived in was more prison than refuge. The staff barely noticed him, and the meals were often just pieces of bread with a smear of jam, if that. Still, Zion never complained. He had grown used to silence, to loneliness, and to being forgotten. But that morning was different. As he passed the back alley of the town's bakery, where yesterday's bread was sometimes dumped, Zion saw something that made him stop. There, lying between 2 trash bins, was a man. His face was pale, his clothes soaked with dew, and his breath shallow. Zion stood still for a moment, unsure if the man was even alive. But then, he saw a faint movement in the man's chest, without a second thought. Zion stepped closer. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He bent down and gently touched the man's forehead. It was cold, too cold. Zion knew what sickness looked like. He had seen it in the orphanage, coughs that turned to wheezing, fevers that led to silence. He couldn't explain why, but something inside him couldn't walk away. He reached into his bag and took out his school scarf, the only warm thing he owned, and wrapped it around the man's neck. That morning, Zion never made it to school. Instead, he returned to the orphanage unseen, snuck into the infirmary, and took a small bottle of cough medicine and 2 bandages. He hid the items under his shirt and slipped out before anyone could notice. He returned to the alley, gave the man sips of water from his old canteen, and whispered words the man could not hear. He didn't know who the man was. He didn't care. He only saw someone who was suffering, and a Zion that was reason enough. As the sun rose higher, casting gold over broken rooftops, Zion leaned his back against the brick wall beside the man, watching him breathe, slow and weak. For the first time in weeks, Zion didn't feel alone. He had skipped school. He had broken rules. But as he looked at the man wrapped in his scarf, sleeping a little more peacefully than before, Zion felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. What he didn't know was that the man beside him was no stranger to pain, and what began as an act of quiet kindness would soon unravel a story neither of them saw coming. To be continued. Ian returned to the alley every day, while other children sat at their desks scribbling letters and numbers. Zion took a different kind of test, one of courage, loyalty, and compassion. He brought small pieces of bread hidden in his sleeves, water in an old soda bottle he filled from a nearby public faucet, and a small towel he had taken from the orphanage laundry. The man, still too weak to stand, lay there day after day, wrapped in Zion's scarf, slowly recovering. Zion never told anyone. He didn't seek praise or attention. This was his secret. And in a world that had given him so little, it was the only thing that felt like it was truly his. With each visit, he grew more careful, more resourceful. He watched the man's breathing. He cleaned the dirt from his hands. He even taught himself how to mix warm water with crushed aspirin from the orphanage's first aid kit. He wasn't a doctor. He was just a boy. But the way he cared, the way he refused to give up, made him something greater than any title could offer. On the 5th day, the man opened his eyes. Zion wasn't prepared for it. He had grown used to speaking to the sleeping figure, telling him stories about the cracks in the orphanage ceiling, about the little bird that nested outside his window, and about how he dreamed of becoming someone who mattered. But now those same eyes, pale and tired, looked back at him. There was no strength in them, only a flicker of confusion, pain, and something else. A faint shimmer of gratitude. Zion didn't flinch. He simply smiled and continued feeding the man tiny pieces of bread softened with water. The man couldn't speak yet. His voice was lost, buried under days of fever and silence. But Zion didn't need words. He understood that sometimes presence meant more than anything said aloud. As the days passed, the man began to sit up. Slowly his hands trembled. Less. His cough, once harsh and unending, softened. He would look at Zion with a mixture of awe and disbelief, as though he couldn't understand why a child, especially a child like him, a poor black boy from nowhere, would choose to care for someone like him. But Zion didn't think in those terms. He saw pain, and he wanted to help. That was all. By the second week, Zion was skipping school every day. The orphanage noticed, but no one cared enough to ask. They assumed he was getting into trouble, like most of the other boys. No one questioned where he disappeared to, or why his shoes were muddy, or why he sometimes came back with bruises from sleeping near alleyways. To them, he was just another lost child in the system. But to the man recovering in the alley, Zion was something entirely different. A lifeline. A miracle. And though Zion didn't yet know it, the man's past was filled with secrets, wealth, and heartbreak. And with every warm gesture Zion made, he was unknowingly unlocking a future that would turn both of their lives upside down. The boy who had nothing was slowly becoming everything to a man who had once lost it all. The third week came with gray skies and cold winds. Rain poured down over the city, making the alley where the man rested feel colder than ever. Zion arrived soaked to the bone, clutching an old blanket he had found in a dumpster behind the church. It smelled of mildew and dust, but it was warm. He wrapped it around the man's shoulders, his fingers trembling from the chill. The man had grown stronger. He could now sit against the wall and sip water on his own. His voice returned in a whisper, cracked and slow. And though Zion still did not ask for details, he listened with the patience of someone far older than his years. From the man's weak words, fragments of a shattered life began to emerge. He had once lived in a large house with tall glass windows and a wife who sang while she cooked. He had held a profession, something to do with helping people, healing them. Though his memory still flickered like a broken lamp, there was a name. He whispered often, Eliza, as if saying it could bring the past back. But behind his stories was a thick fog, a blur of tragedy that made his eyes turn distant. Zion didn't ask for more. He simply nodded, wiped his nose on his sleeve, and held the man's hand when the coughing came back. He did not care who the man once was. To him, he was someone who needed help now. And Zion, despite being only a child, was willing to give. Everything. At the orphanage, things had started to turn. Zion's absence was becoming more noticeable. The director called his name during roll calls with irritation. Other boys began to whisper. His bed was often left untouched and cold at night. No one knew where he went or why he returned late and wet, with scraped knees and bruised hands. Zion didn't flinch. He had grown used to being invisible. He found a strange comfort in that quiet corner of the alley. In a world that had ignored him for so long, he had found someone who looked at him, not with authority or pity, but with a kind of respect. A kind of wonder. One night, Zion stayed longer than usual. The man had tried to stand and nearly collapsed. Zion caught him, despite the man's weight, and eased him back to the ground. The rain beat down on both of them, but Zion didn't move. He placed his thin arms around the man's shoulders, whispering calm through his shivers. That moment, something changed. The man looked at Zion, not just as a boy, but as something deeper. As someone who reminded him of everything he thought the world had lost. There, in that alley filled with damp cardboard and rotting wood, a bond was being formed. Not by blood, but by pain. By healing. By shared silence and sleepless nights. Zion didn't know it yet, But his small acts of kindness had begun to mend something greater than just a sick man's health. That he was healing a soul, and that soul was about to remember who he truly was. By the 4th week, the man no longer looked like a stranger dying in the cold. His cheeks had regained a bit of color. His voice, though still hoarse, could carry full sentences. His hands, once trembling, now gripped Zion's shoulder with warmth. And his eyes, those pale, searching eyes, held clarity for the first time in what felt like years. It happened quietly. One early morning as the fog rolled in thick over the town. Zion had just arrived with a bruised apple and a rag to wipe the man's forehead. The man was sitting upright, knees drawn in, staring blankly into the distance. Then he spoke a name, his own name, Langston Ward. The moment hung heavy in the air. Zion tilted his head. He didn't say anything, but he recognized that something had shifted. Something important had returned. Dr. Langston Ward had once been one of the most respected physicians in the state. He had built hospitals, taught students, and saved lives. But grief is a thief, and when his wife Elisa passed away suddenly, everything began to unravel. His son, just a boy, then was taken away by relatives. Langston, overwhelmed with sorrow, vanished from the life he had built. He wandered from place to place, leaving behind his wealth, his status, and eventually even his own name, until Zion found him, crumpled and fading in a forgotten alley. As the memories returned, so did the pain. Langston sat quietly, haunted by the years he had lost. But every time the darkness came close, Zion was there, with bread, with water, with silent presence. Zion never questioned the name or the past. He simply continued his quiet devotion, treating Langston not as a doctor, not as a rich man, not as someone broken, but as a human being who mattered. And that, more than anything, was what Langston needed. One afternoon, Langston tried to stand on his own and succeeded. Zion clapped his hands, proud but calm. He watched as the man who had once been empty now took small steps forward. They moved together slowly, exiting the alley and walking toward the nearby park. Langston held onto Zion's shoulder for balance. To any passerby, they looked like grandfather and grandson. But there was no blood between them, only a bond stronger than most families could ever claim. At the park bench, Langston sat and looked out across the pond. Children played nearby, their laughter dancing in the wind. But his eyes stayed on Zion. This child, forgotten by the world, had brought him back from the edge of death. Langston knew he couldn't repay him. Money wouldn't be enough. Praise wouldn't be enough. There was only one thing powerful enough to honor what this boy had done. And that thought took root in his heart. He would not leave Zion behind. But life, as always, had its own way of testing the fragile and the kind. And as the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the park, a figure from the orphanage stood at a distance watching, silent, suspicious. Something was about to change again. The days grew warmer, and Zion no longer had to huddle against the wind. His steps were lighter. His smile came quicker. Each morning, he rose not for school, but for something far more important, to walk beside the man who had become his reason. To wake up at all. Langston, now walking steadily with a cane Zion had carved from a tree branch, was stronger with each passing day. His coat was no longer torn. His eyes, once dim, now held clarity. Every evening, they shared simple meals in quiet corners of the park. Pieces of bread and fruit Zion had managed to collect. Though their moments were quiet, they were full of meaning, like two souls learning how to breathe again. But good things, in Zion's life, never lasted long. One morning, as he made his way down the alley to meet Langston, the director of the orphanage was waiting. A tall man with cold eyes and a clipboard in hand. He stood with one of the social workers from the city, whispering, pointing toward Zion's usual path, like someone revealing a secret they had no right to speak. Zion paused. Behind a wall, heart pounding. His mind spun with fear. He had never been caught. No one had ever cared where he went. Why now? The director's voice rang sharp through the alley. They had noticed the boy's absences. They had heard rumors of him sneaking food and medicine. They believed he was hiding something or someone. And they intended to put a stop to it. Zion's legs trembled. For the first time since he had found Langston, the world he had built felt like it was beginning to collapse. That night, he didn't go to the park. He stayed hidden in an old tool shed behind the bakery, heartbroken and eyes wide open. The stars above offered no comfort. He thought about Langston sitting alone on that bench, waiting. He imagined him calling out softly, wondering where his boy had gone. Zion buried his face in his hands and cried quietly into the night, but Langston wasn't the same man he had been weeks ago. The frail stranger in the alley was gone. Now stood a man with memory, strength, and purpose. When Zion didn't appear the next day, Langston went looking. He retraced the streets they used to walk. He searched every corner of the park. And when he asked a vendor if they'd seen a small boy with dark skin and tired eyes, someone pointed toward the orphanage. Langston didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the gates and asked for Zion by name. But they denied knowing him. They claimed no such child was in their care. Their voices were calm, but Langston could see the truth in their guarded expressions. Something was wrong. Back in the shed, Zion listened to the rain fall around him. His head rested against the wooden wall, and his heart felt like it was being torn apart. He didn't know if he could return. Didn't know if Langston would even want him anymore. But what Zion didn't know was that Langston had already made a decision. He would not lose the boy who had saved him, and no institution, no cold-hearted director, no locked gates would change that. Something bigger was beginning to stir. The days grew warmer, and Zion no longer had to huddle against the wind. His steps were lighter. His smile came quicker. Each morning, he rose not for school, but for something far more important, to walk beside the man who had become his reason. To wake up at all. Langston, now walking steadily with a cane Zion had carved from a tree branch, was stronger with each passing day. His coat was no longer torn. His eyes, once dim, now held clarity. Every evening, they shared simple meals in quiet corners of the park. Pieces of bread and fruit Zion had managed to collect. Though their moments were quiet, they were full of meaning, like two souls learning how to breathe again. But good things, in Zion's life, never lasted long. One morning, as he made his way down the alley to meet Langston, the director of the orphanage was waiting. A tall man with cold eyes and a clipboard in hand. He stood with one of the social workers from the city, whispering, pointing toward Zion's usual path, like someone revealing a secret they had no right to speak. Zion paused. Behind a wall, heart pounding. His mind spun with fear. He had never been caught. No one had ever cared where he went. Why now? The director's voice rang sharp through the alley. They had noticed the boy's absences. They had heard rumors of him sneaking food and medicine. They believed he was hiding something or someone. And they intended to put a stop to it. Zion's legs trembled. For the first time since he had found Langston, the world he had built felt like it was beginning to collapse. That night, he didn't go to the park. He stayed hidden in an old tool shed behind the bakery, heartbroken and eyes wide open. The stars above offered no comfort. He thought about Langston sitting alone on that bench, waiting. He imagined him calling out softly, wondering where his boy had gone. Zion buried his face in his hands and cried quietly into the night. But Langston wasn't the same man he had been weeks ago. The frail stranger in the alley was gone. Now stood a man with memory, strength, and purpose. When Zion didn't appear the next day, Langston went looking. He retraced the streets they used to walk. He searched every corner of the park. And when he asked a vendor if they'd seen a small boy with dark skin and tired eyes, someone pointed toward the orphanage. Langston didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the gates and asked for Zion by name. But they denied knowing him. They claimed no such child was in their care. Their voices were calm, but Langston could see the truth in their guarded expressions. Something was wrong. Back in the shed, Zion listened to the rain fall around him. His head rested against the wooden wall, and his heart felt like it was being torn apart. He didn't know if he could return. Didn't know if Langston would even want him anymore. But what Zion didn't know was that Langston had already made a decision. He would not lose the boy who had saved him, and no institution, no cold-hearted director, no locked gates would change that. Something bigger was beginning to stir. Weeks passed. Sunlight now poured through clean curtains in a modest apartment that smelled of fresh bread and lavender soap. Zion sat by the window each morning, sipping warm milk, his eyes brighter, his shoulders less tense. There were still moments when he flinched at sudden sounds or paused at the mention of school, but each day he seemed to take one more step out of the shadows. Langston watched him with quiet awe. The boy who once lived in alleyways now helped fold laundry, lined up his worn shoes neatly by the door, and asked permission before eating the last piece of toast. His soul, shaped by survival in silence, was slowly learning what it meant to be cared for, what it meant to be wanted. But Langston knew the world didn't change just because the heart did. To the courts, to the system that had failed Zion. For years he was still a number in a file, a burden to manage. Langston wasn't just fighting to give him food or shelter. He was fighting to give him something greater. A name. A place in the world. A father. The legal battle wasn't easy. Officials questioned his sudden appearance. They dug into his past. They asked why a former doctor who had once disappeared should now be trusted with a child. Langston answered every challenge with steady truth. He did not beg. He did not boast. He simply showed them the quiet reality that a boy had saved a man's life, and in return, the man was choosing to give him his own. Zion was brought to a hearing room, dressed in a white shirt too big for his small frame. He sat quietly as people he didn't know spoke about him like he was a case, a report, a decision. But when Langston spoke, when his voice filled the room with steady warmth, Zion looked up. He wasn't alone. Langston's final words weren't dramatic. They weren't clever. They were simple. He spoke of a child who gave everything without asking for anything in return. A child who taught him how to live again. And how, in the deepest way, he was already a father, whether the court recognized it or not. There was a long silence after that. And then the gavel fell. Paperwork was signed. Hands were shaken. And just like that, the boy who had been invisible for so long was finally seen. Not as a problem, not as a burden, but as a son. Zion Ward. The name sounded strange on his lips the first time he heard it. But as he walked out of the courthouse, holding the hand of the man he once fed with scraps and nursed back to life, the name began to feel like something else. It felt like belonging. They walked home together in the quiet of the evening. No fanfare, no parade. Just two souls who had chosen one another. When the world had given up, the boy who had nothing had become a son, and the man who had lost everything had become whole again, not through blood, but through love.